Dear part Hello. Dear participants, I would like to invite you because we would like to start in about 2 minutes.
So that's so war das wirklich so schlimm, die Diskussion mit dem Sex, die er leider nicht mehr mitgekriegt hat?
Ach, du warst nicht da.
Nein, die Diskussion. Ich hatte ein
Ich
Paper.
meine, er hat halt gesagt, der Westen hat gegen Osten provoziert, also der Westen hat Putin provoziert und dann hat er auch gesagt, er hat die Sachen gesagt, dass Ukraine wirklich nicht so die Nation ist, dass es da Spaltung gab, also das, was man globalisierende Neoliberale. Auf der anderen Seite hat er, was er gut gesagt hat, war sozusagen dieser amerikanische, hat über den amerikanischen Imperialismus gesprochen.
Ja, ja, das ist ja wichtig.
Ganz,
das
genau.
ist ja zum Teil gibt er das dem Putin Legitimation.
Genau, das habe ich ja auch gesagt. Ich habe ja auch gesagt, frontieren und so weiter.
genau,
Also ich fand schon gut, dass man sowas sagen kann. Damit ist man natürlich hier natürlich trotzdem klang.
Wobei denen das gewusst haben, dass du sagst, das auch, weil das hat er jetzt schon tausendmal geschrieben.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen,
Also es war schon wichtig, aber er hat sozusagen dagegen gehalten.
we're gonna start. So my name is Hubert Walczyński, and I am very happy to be the host of almost the last debate today. And the debate have been called The Dawn of a New Europe. And as it is the last of the 4 debates, I would like us to come to some conclusions out of the 3 preceding debates and sum up all the things that have been said yesterday and add things which will be said today. And in the debate, there will be former Minister of European Affairs Rocco Buttiglione and Professor Agnieszka Cianciara from Institute of Political Studies and Polish Academy of Science. And I have thought about how to start this debate and what would be the good questions to conclude and sum up the topics that have been touched upon yesterday. And I would like our speakers to answer 2 main questions. First of them is what will be the main challenges that we're gonna face in the next decade? And secondly, in what way our current international situation, considering war and pandemics and inflation, is gonna create opportunities in meeting those challenges, or is gonna create obstacles in facing them. So I would like Rocco Buttiglione to start as the first panelist.
Thank you. I must give a forewarning. The forewarning is that I am an Italian, and Italians are always too talkative. And I have been a politician for several years, and politicians can talk at length about any topics, especially if they don't know a word about it. And I am a professor, and professors are the worst of all. So please feel free to stop me when I am taking too much time. And the title that originally has been given to me was The Dawn of Europe. In the English language, there is a very slight difference of pronunciation between down and down. Is a daybreak or a sunset? Nobody really knows. Saint Isidore of Seville wrote the Etymology. It is the great encyclopedia of the Middle Ages. And in the end, he asks himself, it is written in the form of dialogue, so the interlocutor asks him, you have told us the history of mankind since Adam up to now. Why don't you tell us the history from now up to the end of the world? And he answers, because it is not possible because the future is known to God only. History is the place in which the freedom of man and the freedom of God meet, and it cannot be foreseen. Of course, we try to a certain extent, we develop theories, but we must always be open to the fact that reality has more determinations than our theories and can turn our theories upside down. The war in the Ukraine, who could have foreseen that? Who did foresee that? Nobody. And it changed all. I wish to start with some considerations on the war, because the way in which we come out of the war will have a tremendous impact on the future of mankind in general, on all the other issues that are at stake. I don't know how many of you have read the book 1984 of George Orwell. George Orwell has a very penetrating insight into the dynamisms of peace and war in the age of nuclear weapons. And by the way, Pope Francis is saying something not very different when he speaks of a piecemeal Third World War. In a world in which there are nuclear weapons, of course, the great empires cannot attack the core of the empire, of the other empire. If they do, the answer would be a nuclear one and might entail the destruction of a large part of humanity. So this core is safe. Then the war develops in the periphery, and it is endless. Because when you are defeated, you can always gather your strength in the core of your empire and move again to attack. I am afraid that something similar is taking place now in the Ukraine. There has been an offensive of the Russians. Then now there is an Ukrainian counteroffensive. I doubt that this counteroffensive will set free all the land that has been occupied by the Russians. Then winter will come. Then there will be another Ukrainian counteroffensive, and after a while, another one. So I say there is a great danger that the Ukraine may become a no man's land in which war lasts forever. By the way, if you look to the history of the Ukraine, you see that this is not the first time. In the 16th and 17th century, it was a playground for the wars between the Rzeczpospolita and the Ottoman Empire and the Tartars. The Tartars and the Turks had not strength enough to arrive up to Krakow. And the Rzeczpospolita had not strength enough to arrive up to Constantinople. And they kept moving up and down. This had a huge cost for the Ukraine. That's the reason why I think we have got to talk. The idea of ending the war through a debellatio of the opponent does not seem to be at the order of the day. How shall we get out of it? And when? The sooner the better. I think, and here we move to the political, broader world scenario, I think that we are moving from an age in which the United States were the only superpower to a new age in world history in which you have a plurality of superpowers. Some of them are ripe. Well, really, only one of them is ripe, that's China. China is not so strong as the United States, a little bit less, but not very much less. India is growing fast. It will be in 10 to 20 years. And the European Union could be, or is already, if they are a real union. And we need to move to a multipolar system that preserves peace and creates the conditions for cooperation. It seems clear to me that China and India and Turkey, for some reasons we must include Turkey now, are considering the possibility of a mediation. I think we should encourage them. If we do, then this will be the first step towards a multipolar system. The United States will remain the greatest power. It is true that China is approaching them in gross national product. But on that gross national product, China must nourish 3 to 4 times more people than the United States. So the capacity of mobilizing resources to support their foreign policy remains much greater in the United States than in China. Nevertheless, China has become a global factor. Europe could be. And a system that is tripolar or with 4 poles is much more stable than a system with only 2 poles. I don't see with favor the the dissolution of Russia. I remember one motto that is dear to Poles, dla waszą wolność i dla nation, for your freedom and for ours. It is a motto of the Decabrist Revolution, and it was the original meaning was for the freedom of Russia and of Poland, seeing that there was a strong link between the freedom of these two peoples. I think we should recover this culture, this idea. It was also the idea of Norvid. Norvid said that, well, yes, Russia, they are, to a certain extent, they are Mongols, but nevertheless, we must support the European party in Russia. And we need to find interlocutors with Russia, with whom we can speak. We lost a great occasion at the beginning of the 90s, and I hope we don't lose the next occasion. So we have come to speak about the global perspective of a world that must become multipolar. Much depends on the United States. United States need a retrenchment. That is, they need to understand that they have too many areas in which they are directly engaged. They should reconsider their national interest and decide what are the areas in which they really have vital interests. Second, they should reconsider their system of alliances. The alliances of the United States now are unclear. I think the European Union is an interlocutor of the United States. We have so much in common. We belong to the same Atlantic community, but the Atlantic community needs to be reorganized. Needs to be reorganized on 2 pillars, one on one side of the Atlantic and the other on the other side. One taking care of peace and freedom on this side with the help of the other, and the other on the other side. I hope that in United States this idea will gain support. In this moment, I do not see it in the center of the debate in the United States. And now we come to the European Union. I shall not say very much on this because yesterday I already said what I mean. We need a European constitution. The Lisbon treaties do not work. And with the Lisbon treaties, we cannot govern the Union. And if we remain with the Lisbon treaties, we run the risk of having a splitting of the European Union and many states that make a policy of their own. I have been teaching in a German-speaking university for several years in my life, and I am a great lover of German culture. But nevertheless, the idea of the European Union splitting and of Germany emerging as a major military and political power in the center of Europe frightens me. It is not good. It is not good for Germany, first of all, for the German democracy. I remember my great friend Helmut Kohl, the chancellor of the unification, saying always, repeating always, I do not want a German Europe. I want a European Germany. When Germany spends now, in 1 year, 100 billion euros on weapons, 100 billion, in addition to the normal budget, in 1 year. So this year, Germany will spend 150 billion. I think we should have a common European defense in which I am very glad to have a very strong German army in a European defense system. And we need to change the rules of the European Central Bank. We need a common European economy minister, much stronger than the present situation. We need to reform. We have a system that is absolutely crazy. We have no sovereignty. When the so-called sovereignists in Italy, in Poland, protest, they have some good reasons, because the member states are not sovereign. But I do not recover the sovereignty that I have lost as an Italian, as a European citizen, because the European Union does not exercise any sovereignty, because it is too splintered, too bureaucratic. So we need more Europe, but a better Europe. If we don't do that, then we run the risk of having dangerous consequences. A re-emergence of German imperialism and a clash of German imperialism and Russian imperialism in the center of Europe, as we had already twice in the 20th century. So we need a reform of the European Union. This on our side of the Atlantic. More in general, I would think we must consider important economic consequences. We have disrupted the chain of value. Shall we try to reorganize the chain of value on a national basis? It is not possible. Shall we try to reorganize the chain of value on a purely United States basis, a purely European Union basis, Chinese basis, and so forth? It is a sure recipe for war. In this case, if we do that, it could be an effect of the war in the Ukraine, and it could lead to a continuation of the war in the Ukraine for one generation. But in order to avoid this, we need a fresh start and a reorganization of the G20, G7, United Nations, and all the organs of our international system of today. We need a new world governance. Pope Benedict XVI has said this clearly and prophetically, because when he wrote the encyclical Caritas in Veritate, this was not so clear. Now it is apparent. We need a system, a new system of world governance. If you don't have one, then we will become poorer, chain values reorganized on a less than world level, of course, will be much poorer. We will all become poorer on the one hand. And on the other hand, we will come nearer and nearer to war. The poor countries are growing. China is growing. And they have a right to grow, although they have an economy that is almost as large as that of the United States. They still have a per capita income that is perhaps 25% of that of a citizen of the United States. So they have a right to grow. Can we allow them to grow without becoming poor ourselves? Trump says no. They have low salaries, and our companies bring the jobs from the United States to China. And you don't understand the populism of the United States if you do not consider the fact that millions of jobs have migrated from the United States to China, to India, to other countries. What shall we do? At the end of the century, we had an idea. I remember the European Council of Barcelona. We said we must enter into the knowledge economy because 1,000 analphabets cannot do the same tasks as a man who has a doctorate. So we need to enter into the revolution of the information and communication technology, the nanotechnologies, the biotechnologies, the new materials, the new sources of energy, and so forth. We need to spend 3% of our gross national product in innovation and research. And by the way, we need to modernize our university system, our school, and so forth. We did not do that, or we did this only in part. And so we leave a tremendous split in our countries. One half of Italy entered into the age of the economy of knowledge. The other half didn't. And there is a split in the country. But I dare say there is something similar in Poland too. Silesia, Krakow, less, Warsaw, are in the new world. But what about the East? What about Lublin? And in all countries, you find a similar divide. In Great Britain, and this is one of the causes of Brexit and so forth. So I think we need policies to create millions of jobs in advanced sectors so that we can leave the less advanced sectors to China and exchange the products of the old manufacture with the products of the new knowledge economy. This is linked, I have mentioned the information and communication technology. We have been speaking now about states, but there are emerging powers that are not states. If you look to the first, the magazine Fortune publishes every year classification of the wealthiest people in the world. If you look at the first 10 wealthiest men and women in the world, you see that most of them come from the information and communication technology. They unite great entrepreneurial qualities. They are high-level scientists at the same time, chapeau, but they are so rich because they never paid taxes. Where shall the taxes be paid for a service that is provided by a subject who lives in New Zealand in favor of one who lives in Lviv and goes through a certain number of intermediaries between the beginning and the end of the process? Where do they pay taxes? They don't pay taxes. The state has lost the fiscal sovereignty. Let's make one step forward. They can influence our elections. They have a control on our elections. They can influence politics. You know the scandal of Cambridge Analytica. Is it the only case? What is true in what they say about similar manipulations directly through the multinational companies or not directly through them, but using the channels they provide in the case of Italian elections, of Polish elections, of German elections, and so forth? How much of our political life is manipulated? And in the 17th century, the transatlantic commerce was regulated by great companies. And these great companies took the best of the advantages of the commerce. They could buy for 1 gulden in Singapore and sell for 10 in Amsterdam. And they made the profit. Today, there is a new kind of ocean that is internet, and a new kind of commercial companies Take Alibaba. If you want to sell in China, you must stay on Alibaba. If you do not stay there, you will not sell. You may have goods that are much better than those of your neighbor, but if you are not there, you will not sell. And this provides a dramatic alteration of the rules of free and fair competition. We need to have rules. At the beginning of the 17th century, Grotius wrote his famous book, De Mare Libero. Now we need something similar. And again, we go back to the issue. We need a world governance. If we are not having a world governance, then we are having a competition, unfair competition, and in the end, very likely, war, the piecemeal Third World War. So we stand at a crossroad. Which road shall we take? Nobody really knows. Another issue, let's move from the economy to culture. In these last years, we have lived in a theological illusion. The theological illusion is that man is good. And like T.S. Eliot says, lions do not need keepers. Now we have discovered that it is not true. Men are good and are bad, are not unconditionally good. The war has brought this to our attention. And when we thought that men are good, we thought that war was impossible. Now we know that war is possible. We need policies in order to avoid war. Heraclitus has written that war is the father of all things. It is true. War is natural. War comes by itself. Peace is the result of a creative, intelligent action of man. We must construct peace. If we don't, war will arrive. The idea that everybody takes care of himself and there is a kind of natural harmony, not only in the economic sphere, but also in all spheres of life, without the effort to be good, that is, to act according to moral standards, and without any kind of control. This idea is wrong. We have seen that it is wrong, and so we need to revise a certain number of cultural assumptions. Here, I wish to make a reference to an encyclical of Pope Francis, Laudato Si. We are used to thinking also that truth does not exist. We live in a post-truth age. That is, everybody constitutes his own truth and does it together with those who agree with him, with those who have the same temperament. So there is people gather together and play games of virtual reality. What if Hitler had won the Second World War? Some people like more the world in which Hitler had won the Second World War. And we live in a plurality of artificial worlds, of games. And the distinction between those games and reality grows. If you take the events that accompanied the last presidential election in the United States, it is apparent many people lived in a game and exchanged that game with reality. We have movies who tell us about the deep state, and people think the deep state really exists and are ready to interpret what happens according to the presupposition that is given to them by some narratives that do not correspond to reality. Now war and the pandemic
is not working. Oh, it is working. Okay.
Good.
We need to be moving to like concluding remarks. So a few last sentences, please, because the time is running up.
I close. I
Thanks.
arrive. They bring us back to the fact that there is reality. Reality exists. And if you can do whatever you want. But if you do not do the right thing, you will die. I think this brings us a tremendous cultural change if we are able to think it through. Thank you for your attention, and I beg your pardon for the time I have taken.
Thank you very much. Professor Agnieszka Cianciara. Yeah, you can take the mic. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, and a big thank you to the organizers for having me here. Unfortunately, I was not able to join you for yesterday's discussions due to prior commitments, so please forgive me if I will not be able to relate, for obvious reasons, to what was said yesterday. Now, contrary to Professor Buttiglione, I'm not a politician, I'm a political scientist. I'm not Italian, but I'm Polish, but I do have Italian ancestors. So there is high probability I'll be talking a lot as well. So Hubert, please do not hesitate to stop me at some point. Now, I'm researching European integration, EU politics and decision making. I'm no futurologist. I don't do foresight analysis. I'm very much aware of the limits to extrapolation of past and current trends to the future. So I'm not sure I'm a great match for your questions, actually. But what I can do in the framework of my competences is to provide you with my understanding of the progress the European Union has made over the last decade or 15 years, and to reflect on where it currently stands, while possibly giving you some ideas for the future. But here I'm really cautious. It's really, you know, kind of researcher mindset, data and stuff. I would probably start with an argument about the crucial importance of the external shocks that the EU was confronted with over the last 15 years. Here I see 4 of them: the global financial crisis, the migration crisis, the pandemic, and obviously recently the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, in reflecting on EU responses to those crises, I will obviously not go into details, because that would take a lot of your time. But what I would like to underline is that if we look at the EU responses to those external shocks, if we look at the speed of decision-making, if we look at the quality of decision-making, and if we look at the solidarity that was there between the member states, despite the differences that persisted, and if we compare the EU response to, well, the global financial crisis that of course entailed the crisis in the Eurozone, and if we compare the EU response to the economic consequences of the pandemic that have been considered as the deepest economic recession since World War II, if we consider EU response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think we can very clearly state that the EU did a huge effort in terms of adaptation and in terms of learning, and in terms of providing viable solutions despite the persistent differences. And this, I think, can be quite striking, and it can be quite surprising, especially if we consider the pretty omnipresent language of crisis, decline, disintegration that we could observe in public discourses across the EU member states, not to mention outside of the EU. We could also link that to the, discourse of the decline of liberal order, liberal democracies, political liberalism in general, and the competition that the liberal democracies are confronted with coming from non-democratic governance models that are supposedly more effective than democratic governance models. I think that the response to the pandemic, and even more so the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, really provides important arguments that counter those discourses. And it seems to me that actually, authoritarian states appear quite strong until they are pressured. And then once they are pressured, we can clearly see many weaknesses. And the weakness as such is not an issue. The issue is how you deal with those weaknesses. And it seems to me that liberal democracies that may appear weak until they are somehow provoked, or until they are somehow challenged, they have better tools to deal with the weaknesses and with the pressures coming both from outside and from the inside. And one thing is this ability to learn and adapt. And this ability is much, much greater in open than closed systems. So I would argue that the EU has proved to be much, much stronger than many of us used to think, or maybe are still thinking. And let me take the example of the sanctions regime. If we look back at the sanctions story of 2014 and how much time it took for the EU to agree on very selective and very targeted sanctions towards Russia, or even come up with a common understanding that Russia is actually not a part of a solution, but part of a problem. And then when we compare it with the days or weeks, maybe weeks actually, earlier this year, where the EU, together with its outside, mainly transatlantic partners, was able to agree on bringing Russian economy down within a matter of weeks. That is something I think extremely, extremely important. And it seems to me also that the main question about the sanctions regime is not so much the question of whether the sanctions will be maintained or prolonged or strengthened. Because despite a number of problems and a number of countries which are labeled, such as Germany, or actually are Russian Trojan horses in the EU, as Hungary, or despite declarations from different European politicians, such as recently Silvio Berlusconi, who basically claimed, if I'm not mistaken, that Vladimir Putin was simply trying to replace Zelensky government with a government of decent people. I think despite all those elements, it is not, the key question is really not about whether the sanctions will be maintained or lifted over the next months or years. It is rather about how to conduct the absolutely crucial transformation away from the dependence on external, including Russian, of course, in this sense, resources, how to link this energy transformation with the climate-related transformation in the European Green Deal, and perhaps more importantly, how to make EU or rather EU member states resilient while reducing the side effects or perverse effects of sanctions, because this is the crucial challenge, I think, that we are facing right now, and how to protect, as in consequence, EU democracies from both external and internal threats. The external threats have been obviously usually associated with Russia and the intervening in the electoral processes in the member states. Somehow less importance has been, or less insistence has been put on China, although this has also been progressively reflected as in a recent State of Union speech of Ursula von der Leyen. But of course, there is a link between those external and internal threats to democracy, as we could have seen with the important political, financial impact of Russian influence on a number of political forces in Europe that have been shaping political discourses across the member states and across the European public sphere, for instance, the European Parliament. So I would insist this dichotomy between autocracy and democracy is something that is going to be crucial for the EU, within the EU, and also in its dealings with the outside world. Now, another crucial question that comes to my mind, and this is more directly related to this topic of the dawn of New Europe, is the question of the new balance of power within the EU. Whether it is emerging, to what extent it is emerging as a consequence, direct consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the shift of resources and political weight towards Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, it is important to me personally, because it is a question about the position of Central and Eastern Europe within the EU, the eventual empowerment of the region, and in particular, whether my own country, Poland, would be able to use this obvious window of opportunity, and to what extent it would be willing and able to use this window of opportunity in a situation where we have clearly a lot of changes and a lot of question marks with regard to Germany, not only the most powerful member state of the European Union, traditionally its leader, whether the leadership was supported or contested from the Polish side. Germany, that is currently undergoing a major transformation when it comes not only to its, let's call them mental maps, but also its policies, energy policy, economic policy, foreign policy, security policy, etc. And this obviously constitutes a major challenge for Poland, which has been always somehow caught between two ideas, going with Germany or trying to distance itself from Germany or contest German leadership. So, in fact, Poland was, by the Russian invasion, it was really put at the center of events and was granted this window of opportunity, not because of its particular, capacities or resources or virtues, but basically because of the geographical location. And now the question is how Poland is using this opportunity, and actually it seems to me that using this opportunity to the full also requires a complete change of strategy within the European Union, because when I look at the Polish strategy in the EU since 2015, it is more a kind of, liberum veto, sticking to the unanimity as a defensive tool, since most of the developments in the EU have been perceived by the government more as a threat than as an opportunity. So if we are thinking about, playing an active leadership role, obviously this approach is no longer viable. So contestation only, troublemaking only, or self-exclusion is no longer the way to go. So there are a lot of questions on how this could be changed by 180 degrees, actually. And just to, maybe not to conclude, but as my final point, I would dig a little bit deeper into the contradictory demands and pressures that that Poland is facing, but which are also, important from the point of view of the entire EU. So the first element is obviously, the question of the qualified majority voting, and this seems like a technical issue, but of course it carries huge political burden. But then again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the sanctions regime poses direct questions as to whether sticking to unanimity in the EU in foreign policy and in all matters of foreign policy is a viable solution any longer, having, for instance, Hungary on board or possibly considering developments in other member states. Then, and I think there is a reference here to what Rocco Buttiglione said earlier, but it also reflects very well, the Polish dilemma is this kind of, dilemma between being somehow unhappy with the German inaction, if you observe the, what the government says and the media, which are closer to the government, the unhappiness with how little Germany does in order to support Ukraine, both economically and militarily. But at the same time, there is this fear of German militarization and the huge money that the German government is supposed to throw onto its new military and, broadly speaking, security policy. So somehow there is a contradiction. There is a contradiction here, and the crucial question is to what extent Poland and other member states obviously have the resources and the capacities to actually influence, first of all, the German debate about how to shift how to make this important shift or important transformation in the areas I've mentioned earlier. And again, to me in particular, a key question is what is the Polish strategy in shaping the German debate and German action. Then again, there is the discussion in Poland, and a number of member states from our region have been long supporters of membership of Ukraine and other countries covered until now by the Eastern Partnership policy, and obviously advocates of Ukraine's candidate status. But then again, the question is how do we shape the debate about reforming EU enlargement policy, although this is a very minimalist way of thinking, because quite clearly the enlargement policy, a very bureaucratic tool used by the European Commission that we know in Central Europe, is no longer adequate. It has been inadequate since quite some time. It has been inadequate for the Balkans. It is clearly inadequate for Eastern Europe under current circumstances. So how to transform the instruments that the EU and its member states have to bring the key external actors not only closer to the EU, but as part of the EU. And then the entire debate about different layers of differentiated integration is there. It's partly an academic debate, partly also a very practice and policy-oriented debate. But it somehow comes as a surprise that we have we are flooded with proposals about the, for instance, European political community from the French President Emmanuel Macron. But somehow, at least I'm not able to see a comprehensive and consistent proposal coming from our region. And then, obviously, again, from the Polish perspective, there is this kind of tension between, on the one hand, the need for cutting the dependency, the energy dependency from Russia on one hand, and very skeptical attitude towards EU climate policy on the other. Again, contradictions are numerous, I'm just signaling them. And then finally, I would argue there is again this tension between fighting Russian propaganda and disinformation on the one hand, and bandwagoning on Russian style, I would argue, conservative revolution on the other, which can be visible not only in Poland, but also in a number of other member states coming from the so-called populist or sovereignist political forces. So I leave it here. So I hope I didn't take too much of your time, and I'm happy to listen to and to participate in the general debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is the end of the first part of the discussion. So the stream is supposed to terminate right now. And from now on, we are in a Chatham House type debate. So we are not supposed to quote the authors of the statements that will be quoted. And the first voice I have is from Marcin.
Thank you very much. I'm
1, 2, 3, 4.
Michał Sutowski is kindly invited to proceed to the gate number 4.
And fasten your seatbelts.
Okay. We changed a little bit the form of the table, but there are two reasons for that. I think maybe even three reasons. This is the final debate that should sum up the seminar and why it is unique. It is unique because we invited the representatives of the most popular Polish intellectual magazines to the seminar organized by the academia. And the meet between academia and the intellectual circles is something unique, at least at the Polish stage. The second of all, the project Confrontations, where all 5 magazines take part, is unique, I think, at the global level, because these are 5 magazines that represent different ideological attitude or approach. So let me introduce the panelists with the affiliations now. From my left, Paweł Musiałek from Jagiellonian Club, who represents the Christian conservatives. Hubert Walczyński from magazine Contact, that represents the Catholic left. Then Katarzyna Kasia, who represents the liberal Kultura Liberalna. Jarema Piekutowski, who represents Nowa Konfederacja, which is center-right. And at the end, Michał Sutowski, that represents Krytyka Polityczna, that is the left, or represents the left side of the political scene. And that is unique because since 2019, all 5 magazines are trying to answer monthly, each month, they're trying to answer the same questions and to present the different perspectives. So that is a unique debate between not only political parties, but also between the intellectuals, the public intellectuals. And it will be quite different than the before sessions, because this is rather a panel, not a discussion like the Chatham House. So it will be streamed. The whole panel will be streamed. And I would like to start with an initial question and then give the floor to the speakers so that they can confront with each other about their findings, about their opinions. And my initial question that I would like to start is that our seminar was dedicated or aimed to discuss the problem of the limits of state action, what states in the future can do and what they cannot do. As Professor Wydra called in the introductory keynote lecture, where are the limits? What does it mean, the limit? Whether we can cross the lines and where are the lines. And we, during the last 2 days, we were debating many crises. The COVID crisis, the Russian assault on Ukraine, but also the financial crises, the inflation, and the climate crisis. So my introductory question, then I give the floor to the speakers, is whether the state is able to tackle these challenges and to which extent is possible to do so. So I don't want to indicate the speaker. Who of you would like to start? Is there any volunteer? So Jarema was first and then Kasia, okay.
All right, as a well-known Polish film, in a well-known Polish film, there's a quote that on every gathering someone must start. So I will be this one, and I think my my answer will be a bit personal, because I used to be libertarian in the past, but observation of the changes in the modern world made me lean more towards trust in a state. It's not that I trust it totally, but we found ourselves in a situation when state has to compete with big organisms, and actually we, the people, the civilians, have a choice to be governed by a state, possibly wise state, or by other forces, including the great technological giants, companies, and cultural and media forces. So the first answer is that yes, we need state because the alternative might be not as good for us as the libertarians think. However, whether the state is able to tackle these challenges, I think you meant challenges like COVID-19 pandemic or the Putin's invasion on Ukraine. Well, let's start with the COVID-19. In Poland, we had 200,000 excess deaths during the times of COVID. By excess deaths, I mean that is 2,000 people more died than the average from last years. It was a sad example of 200,000. What did I say? So sorry, but the first time I said 200,000, so I know how many people was this. It was a sad example of a failure of the state. To tackle challenges like this, state has to be well organized and has to serve the common good. How to achieve such a state? I think from the observation of the Polish political scene, there's a need for, at first, there's a need for strong institutions which have, it's called, sometimes it's called deep state, but I don't like this, this expression very much because it has bad connotations sometimes in the US, but I mean a system of checks and balances and institutions grounded deeper than the short term to the next, the short time to the next election. What happened in Poland, for example, was that during the COVID crisis, the government decided to, the governing party decided to organize the presidential election when it was really really dangerous for the people to engage in such a mass enterprise like going to the election. So I think the first thing to build these institutions, we need something like a state doctrine which is deeper than the party interest, the particular partisan interests. The second thing we need, and sadly in Polish I think we don't have it, is evidence and reason, fact, evidence-based based policy. Very hard to achieve in times of Twitter politics, of emotion politics, and so on. We need a constant flow of information facts and data from the independent experts to the state, and grounding the state decisions in these data. The third thing is cooperation. I mean, international cooperation. The COVID crisis actually, it was not only failure in Poland, it was failure in many states, governed better than Poland. And it showed a necessity of what Mr. Rocco Buttiglione said, of a necessity for some governance on the international level. For example, stronger international institutions like the EU, but those institutions are in big crisis. So this challenge must be also tackled. But the single states won't be able, for example, to compete with the technological giants, or with threats from Russia or other autocratic, expansive countries. So let me review this. First thing is long-term perspective, longer than the next election, and thinking about common good. Second thing is data-based policy, and third thing is international cooperation.
And then Pavel.
Thank you very much. A brief review of the situation. Thank you for doing this. So I will not repeat, but thinking of the state action in terms of shift or of need now, what we can see after the time of, or during the time of pandemic and during the time of war, we realized that we have to revise our idea of state action, and that we are in the place when some immediate decisions will have to be made. And I think that here in Poland, we faced a very strange situation. I mean, the state is absent in very many ways. Like, we can observe this absence when we, or it is, on one hand, it can be called absence, on the other, over-presence, or it is too present. Because on one hand, let's take first example of the education and educational politics. We can see that this state is absent because it does not cover the real needs, and we can face something that Łukasz Pawłowski from Kultura Liberalna called second wave of privatization. So we can see that people take their children from public schools because public schools do not function anymore, and they transfer the kids to the not public schools, which is expensive, but every time it is possible, people decide to do it, even if they have to go in debt for the school for their kids, because the public system does not work. And so here we can talk about the absence, but it is somehow combined with the over-presence, because we have too many political decisions, thinking about the school program and the changes that are introduced and the reforms that are introduced just in a very bad way. So yeah, the state takes an action, but this action is rather destructive. And the same thing we can observe in the judiciary system, we can observe it in the healthcare system. And I know that the generalizations are really bad, but I will generalize. We can see it in every important area of the social life in Poland. And there is also another question, because Poland is a member of European Union. And it is important that we combine the state action as a state of Poland with the actions taken by the European community. And this, we can see that during the pandemics, for example, the great decisions about sanctions you mentioned, and about buying the vaccines on the European level, which was much more easy for the nation states. These decisions were important and the actions were taken. But other decisions during this process of growing crisis, economical crisis, the post-pandemic fund in the European Union was created, but Poland did not take part of that. So we can see that some European actions are neglected by Poland. And this is the problem, because we can talk about the limits, as Professor Wydra yesterday was speaking about the question of border and borders as limits. And I think that in case of the EU, we can talk about broadening the borders. So we are not in our state borders only anymore, but we should, because we agreed to be a part of much bigger political organism. But we are not supporting these actions. And when I'm thinking about these limits of the state action, I see these two problems. So one is that these limits are very strangely understood by the actual Polish politicians, governing politicians, I mean. And on the other hand, I think that there is no goodwill of accepting the fact that Poland is the member of the EU. And yes, I would like to finish here. And
I would like to pass the voice to Paweł Musiałek, but I would like to strongly, encourage you to go beyond only the Polish perspective, but also look at the institution of state, because I suppose that the problems with the state limits is not only the Polish problem, the case of Poland. Of course, we have some characteristics, but I think that we might touch also upon the institution of state. Now Paweł and then Michał Złotowski.
Yes, thanks Marcin for that comment, because of course it is very encouraging for me to comment your thesis. I'm going to tell more about the state, not only in case of Poland, but one sentence only to comment your statement, because we have some on the audience, some people from different countries, so these theses are quite controversial. It's not something. It's not. The theses are not shared by whole expert, and I think that especially the thesis regarding education or regarding how we should behave during the COVID-19, it is a complex situation. So let's put Poland aside and let's go to the state as such. I think that my main thesis is that during the COVID-19 and during the war, the first and foremost, the most important thesis is that the state is back. The state is back very strongly, and I think to some extent effectively. But of course, the problem I think that is very visible is that our expectation, what state should done, is growing faster than resources we have to do that. And this is the most important problem, because when I just wondering about how states react on COVID-19. I just wondering, okay, what should we do more? Our reaction is all about crisis management, but I cannot see any good solutions that we did that time that changed situation completely. Okay, maybe when we have a different government in Poland, the deaths will be limited from 200,000 to 150, but still is a huge number of people who died, and died not only in Poland, died in other countries. And my question is, do we really believe that we have the resources to stop this process? And I think that the answer is not. The answer is not. And what is worth to mention, I don't think we have in our history any period of time when the state action would be more effective than today, but our expectations from this state are huge and uncomparable with the ones in the past. And this is the huge difference. And now, when I talk about that the state is back, it doesn't mean that the EU institution and global institution is not working and other actors is not important, like society. We see in Poland, just after the war, that only fast, intensive reaction by the state and by our whole society, Polish society, cause that we can manage the crisis situation on the Polish-Ukrainian border and manage the consequences of the flow of millions of people. So I don't want to say that other actors are not important, but still the state is in the center, and it is in the center by means of expectation from the people. And I think that what the consequences on economic fields is that after 2008, Martin very often underlined this thesis, we see that neoliberal paradigm is over, and I think now it's over even more. I think after the COVID, after the war, now we see a very strong state activism, and on many fields. It is more regulation, more state-owned companies, more interventions, more ingerence in the free market. So I think that this process will be even stronger in the nearest future. And I think that the most important trigger that it will cause this state action is that energy crisis that now we are starting to see, it will be not over during this winter. We should know that the process of the Russification of energy system in Europe will last many, not months, but years. And now we will start to pay the cost of that relations with Russia that we have as a whole Europe. And of course, this cost we have to pay, but it means that state intervention into not only energy market, because energy crisis cause crisis in many other fields of our economy. It means that in the nearest future we will see that this state action will be much more. The role will be much more active than even today. So my thesis is that in the nearest future, we'll see that the free market mechanism will be much more limited, but it doesn't mean that the coherence of the society that Marcin mentioned during the discussion will be bigger. Why? Because unfortunately, even our states and other states will intervene on the market. Our resources will be very limited, and unfortunately, the level of standard condition will be limited in all Europe. And I don't think so. Even the most effective states can stop this process, and it means, of course, very seriously political consequences. which I think that we'll have possibility to discuss in later. So stop now.
So now we are moving dynamically from the conservative right to the left, and Michał, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think this opposition that Katarzyna Kasia defined between the overpresence and the absence of the state corresponds quite well with the opposition that was defined by Professor Michael Kennedy as the one between addressing of issues and expressing power. I think it's crucial in our Polish context, because I think due to a very specific experience of the Third Republic in Poland, then earlier the communist era, too many Polish people believed that we cannot reasonably expect from the state that it would address many issues that we face as a society, that the expression of power is actually the only thing left, or the only thing that we can expect from the politicians, and the only kind of a promise that we can believe. A promise the politicians make to their voters. As to the question of whether the state, or what are the limits of the state action, I think, of course, the obvious answer is it depends on which action, which state. I mean, because Marcin, you said that it would be good to get slightly away from the Polish context and talk about the state as such, but I think that, especially in the context of recent crises we had in the world, also the global ones, which gave us some sort of a good comparative perspective, it is good, like, to rather to think in terms of a very specific place and situation where we are now, because when we take for example, the COVID pandemics, I think remember all that, how we were with huge interest, we were observing how the Southeastern Asian states are dealing with the pandemics, and of course I do not mean China, but I mean states like South Korea or Taiwan, or Singapore, combining highly efficient state apparatus with a very high level of trust towards public service and the state. I do not idealize those countries and those cultures. They also have those societies also have their own problems, but nevertheless, as we observed that those countries deal relatively efficiently with the COVID pandemics, we also knew very soon how far, especially not after first weeks, but after first months or first year of the pandemics, we could clearly see how distant those countries, not only in geographical terms, are from us, from our situation, from our state, where the level of distrust towards public institutions is extremely high, and also, well, the inefficiency of the state apparatus is a more controversial matter. How it is perceived and how it is in reality, we could discuss that fact later. I think yesterday this was Janina Patalczyk who mentioned the social security institution, which is perceived commonly, or is, well, there are controversies as to the perception as well, but still there is a common notion that it's a dysfunctional institution. On the other hand, we know that the administrative costs of this institution are one of the smallest in comparison to similar institutions in other countries. So in terms of economic efficiency, it clearly works quite well. And of course, what happened, we had subsequently a few crisis, one after another. So first the COVID crisis, the pandemics, which in Poland, in my opinion, on one hand, changed it. You could see that in some qualitative social research, that it changed our awareness as to the fact how important the state is as an entity that should solve some our problems. For example, it was due to the fact, for example, that the parents saw how the school actually works when their children had to learn online. Of course, the state of the healthcare became a huge topic. On the other hand, so this was at the level of awareness, of consciousness. On the other hand, we had the level of the institutions themselves, and here we had actually a huge gap between those rising expectations and aspirations and the true state of those institutions, because in my opinion, public schools and public healthcare, they deteriorated enormously during that period. So the gap between expectations and the reality actually increased enormously. And then again, we had a war in Ukraine, and then a huge, massive wave of refugees coming to Poland. Of course, there was the obviously right decision of the government to open the borders, but, and this is of course, I'm referring here to yesterday's speech by Minister Emilewicz. Well, I think at some level, this reception of refugees was a huge success, but rather of the Polish society than of the Polish state. Poland actually became a huge, Polish society became a sort of a huge NGO, ironically called Zrzutka.pl. It's hard to translate into English. Zrzutka.pl, it's an internet platform to organize crowdfunding. So the Polish society became a huge grassroots platform, organizing itself spontaneously in order to receive and support the refugees with very little help from the state institutions and with a lot of tensions between different levels of administration, especially between the local administration, municipal administration, and the central one. So I think that all those experiences, with a very difficult starting point at the beginning of the COVID pandemics, it brought about a situation in which the gap between the expectations of the society and the awareness of the how much state we need and how functional state we need, and the reality of that state, this gap becomes really, really horrendous. I think that I think we're going to talk later about the possible solutions. So maybe that would be the point in which I stop, and then we'll continue.
Okay, so now Hubert, and then come back to Jarema for the second ad vocem session or round.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to kind of second what Paweł said, that the main limit of the state action right now is lack of means compared to expectations, and by means, I personally understand simply money and budget and taxes income, and it is what limits the extent to which we can actively act in the economy. But the second thing, which I find much more important and much more crucial in the long term, is political imagination. So the idea of what state is for, and I think it has changed tremendously during the last 40, 50 years. And I'm going to give you two examples for this. So Professor Butlidzione mentioned earlier Amazon and Alibaba as two large corporations, one for the Western Hemisphere, one for the Eastern one. And if we look at Amazon and compare it to our vision of a city, it is as if we had one single marketplace in the city, which is private. And we all pay to the richest guy on the earth for a possibility to buy and sell goods there. Facebook or Twitter are like public squares that are private, and they have significantly undermined our democratic process during the last few years. So again, we are accepting the fact that there are only 2 or 3 places where we can, in the internet, share our ideas and thoughts. They are privately owned, and they are right now self-regulating after the Cambridge Analytica, of course. But the question is, do we want to have a better regulated public square which is privately owned, or do we want to have publicly owned public square? And what should we do with it? I think that the answer is part of the problem of political imagination. I mean, 50 years ago, when we had monopolies, there were 2 answers for monopolies. One was to break them up, and the other one was to nationalize them. And we were breaking up, I know, Ronald Reagan was breaking up AT&T in the 1980s. But we obviously don't want to break up Facebook because we do not need 5 or 10 Facebooks, where in each of them we'll have only 1 or 2 of our friends. So I think what we should do basically is to reclaim to the public what used to be public in the real world, but in the virtual internet world became private and was never challenged by the state. And if it sounds utopian, as how can we nationally or internationally own and capture global corporations, or even how to govern it later on and how to make it work, I would like you to think about Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is the most utopian process which went right. I mean, it's a largest, best encyclopedia ever, which is better than Britannica according to a lot of research, comparative research being done between those 2. And it is created by anonymous people who work for free, there are no ads, and we use it every day, and it works. And it's one of the things that if they weren't here, nobody would ever believe that are even possible. So if we can create, in a corporate-free way, even in a state-free way, a largest encyclopedia in the world, my question is, isn't it possible to create a public square which will be not owned by companies and which will work much better in kind of same manner? And I believe it is, but I'm a leftist, so maybe that's why. Thank you.
Jerema.
All right. Paweł's and Marcin's remarks were right that I concentrated too much on Poland, so I'd like to say something more general about defining the limits of state action. Here's my proposal, how they should be defined. I'm an eager defender of the subsidiarity principle, of the principle which is mentioned rarely in last 2-3 years. It simply says that a task which can be performed effectively on the lower level of governance, for example, locally or by people themselves, shouldn't be performed on the higher level, for example, by central institutions of the state or even on global level. Of course, well, why am I a defender of this principle? Because I think it gives us a good balance between freedom and security. And of course, we deal with more and more complex reality, and more tasks can't be performed effectively on the lower levels, facing the internet, the technological change, the interconnectivity, and so on and so on. However, we need informed experts. That's what I told at the first time about the data-based policy, evidence-based policy. We need informed experts who can assess the complexity of certain task or problem, consult it with the people on the lower levels, and or help people assign this task to a lower or higher level of governance. And this would let us avoid the absence or the overpresence of the state. Facing such a complexity, of course, we need strong states. But a strong state doesn't mean a big state, which does everything, which has a lot of people and a big bureaucratic apparatus, which actually proved to be inefficient, proves sometimes to be inefficient in the European Union. Well, maybe not with the COVID, because that's where European Union did quite well, but earlier sometimes. So a strong state doesn't mean to be too big. A strong state doesn't mean over-present. A strong state means agile and professional. Agile, this is a term used often in the IT sector. So it reacts to the changes fast. And such a state, of course, also costs a lot of money, but because you have to employ the best people. And I have to give a Polish example, because our state institutions pay very low salaries to the people who actually change and shape our situation in local governments and in the government. And it can't go on forever, because the state will be totally inefficient this way. But as I said, strong doesn't mean too big, and we should keep the subsidiarity principle in mind. Thank you.
As academic, I'm always in favor of the proposal of raising the remuneration of public service, but I think that the agile public management sounds to me like a Yeti, but now I would like to pass the voice to Paweł.
Yeah, I'm very short. I very like, Jarema, your proposition to remind the conception of subsidiarity, because I think that is a very good answer. And I think that your thesis that the big state doesn't mean that this state is effective, and effective state, it doesn't mean is big. I even go further, because I think that the more expectation we define, the more we want from the state to do, the less effective the state is. And I think that this is maybe the most important challenges that we have facing the all challenges regarding COVID, war, but many other civilization process, yes, and political process like polarization, that kind of things. I think that we should really define in what field we expect effect from the state. Where is the field that we say, okay, we agree that this is too much, state cannot, is not the answer, and maybe this should be solved on an international level or on a local level, or even should be solved by the people themselves. Maybe individually, maybe in a household, maybe in a very local, neighborhood. So this is the challenge that I want to put. That we should really refigure that maybe this additional balls that we that are in the air, maybe we should take some of it and put on another table of individuals, people, international institutions, but really and be more consequent to expect from the state the crucial, fundamental roles that is core of the state action, and especially now during the fundamental threat by means of hard security, by means of education, by means of economic crisis. I think that this is the core fields that I expect from Polish state, and I suppose that this is the point of view that will be shared by other Europeans. This is the field that states should play important role, maybe even bigger, but refigure. Maybe we should something limited and something transferred to another tables, another fields. So that's my point.
Kasia.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with saying that you wanted a broader discussion about the state actions not limited to Poland. And in some way, it is understandable and acceptable, absolutely. But I think that this is very hard now because, as Michał said before, after a pandemic, the state borders were reinstalled and different strategies were reintroduced or introduced. So there is a huge difference between various states, even if we take Europe as an example, in how much action are taken by the governments and how the governments act in order to create some sort of security, healthcare security, for example, for the different nations. And it is important that I think that somehow, because of the pandemics and that what happened in 2020, the very idea of the nation state came back into action. So we were supposed to talk about the states in a very different manner than in 2018, for example, when the idea of European Union and forthcoming the federality or the idea of federation was much more probable. And I think that when we talk about this state action in the very broad sense, this would be some sort of escapism, because we can't compare different strategies, or we can compare them, but for what purpose? It is always a practical question. What do we do? What do we expect our government to do? And it somehow relates to the question that really remained with me for the last 24 hours, posed by Orstein after our very philosophical discussion. And there was a question about practical consequences and what to do and how can we act. And I totally agree with this question and with this very practical point of view. And that's why I don't think it is, for me at least, useful to talk about some generalities and actions and politics, because I think that we can give examples and that only the discussion based on evidences and on real examples can give us some better approach to the questions that we are discussing. For example, the question of the limits of the state actions. And so I think that this comparative research is interesting, and from the academic point of view, maybe even, I don't know, can be useful. But on the practical point of view, and don't understand me in a wrong way, I'm a really huge fan of the useless knowledge, but I think that we don't have a lot of time here, and that there is a huge difference between talking in general terms when the situation is peaceful and everything goes in the right direction, and the situation of war, of pandemic, and of something that we might call climate change apocalypse. So I think that now, and I totally agree with Orstein, we should really think about real solutions. And here I come to the topic of the state action. We really need to focus on our funds and sources. And here I totally agree with you, Paweł, that we should decide what to do, and we should have government we could trust that they will do it well, and that they will not waste the resources, and they will not make any useless reforms of educational system, for example, but they will spend this money in a way that will really support the society and will be useful for the society. And here comes the question, how could we do it? So how could we protest against wasting? for example, here, talking about security, we are facing the biggest energetic crisis in the history of modern world. And we can here compare the actions taken by various states in order to provide sources of energy for their countries and for their states or for their societies. And if we have this map, we can see what the Polish government did and what was not done. And I think that in this comparison, we can see how the resources are wasted and how the actions, instead of being just for the country, are just mistaken.
Before Michał Sutowski will answer, I would like to specify the question and add something more practical, is that during the last hours we were debating the challenges, and usually the politicians are trying to address these challenges with the narrative and the language of profits. But always you have the second side of the balance sheet, which means that, or the financial statement, that you have costs, and the costs also are distributed, and are distributed either equal or in an unequal way. And the question is whether the states, or the state institution, the Polish state, but also the other states, are still able to manage the distribution of costs of these policies that are aimed at answering these challenges.
I think the specification of the question fits quite well what I wanted to say, because actually the pandemics in Poland shows exactly the way how this government sees the question of the distribution of costs and burdens in a situation of a crisis. We have something that Professor Rafał Matyja once called nationalization. It's in the neoliberal era, there was this tendency towards privatizing the national assets, different kinds of like public institutions and so on. And during the crisis, during the pandemics, we had a situation of a nationalization of private assets, meaning hard work and free time of teachers, public workers, healthcare workers on different levels, workers of the sanitary services, all of them, social security institution, all of them heavily underpaid, were in a way expected to sacrifice their spare time, family, to work over time, without proper remuneration and without even symbolic appreciation of what they do. So, because it's, and I can understand that if we think about the distribution of costs of, for example, of a transformation towards some new reality, then that's understandable that we think about taxes, for example, from progressive taxation, and that's rightfully so. But for me, the problem now is that we have the costs are not only in monetary. I mean, costs are not only monetary. I mean, this is also how we expect different sectors of the society to bear the burden in terms of its work and engagement. So I think that the pandemics showed, and that's one thing. So that's the cost, the burden was put onto the arms of the public sector workers. That is one thing, and the other, and this puts me to the question of power versus control, or power versus ability to address the issues. A lot of responsibility, again, without compensation, financial and other ones, were put from the central government to the local governments and municipalities. And this is not only a problem of a party capture of the state, which is obviously a risk today, but there is also a situation in which I think we are, as a state or as a political community, we are now getting back, or not back, but getting back again to the situation well known from the late 70s and the 80s in Poland, where the government, or the party, the ruling party, tried to get as much power, to consolidate as much power and control as possible. And the more power and formal control they had, the less ability to control the reality they had. The reality meaning like external, because those were not only internal contradictions of socialist economy. No, this was more. This was, for example, the question of energy. Few people remember that in the 70s we had a huge energy crisis due to the fact that we had a centralized economy, centralized also in terms of energy system, based on one kind of resource, and with an enormous inefficiencies in the economy, energy inefficiencies. This is what, probably that was one of the main factors that brought this whole system to the collapse at that time. And I think the part of the reasons for that was the, at that time, mostly ideological inability, like to, on the side of the power elite, to think in terms of power as sort of a coordination of action between different autonomous actors. And here, of course, we have a totally different reality because we have, for example, self-government, we have municipalities, which was not the option in the 70s, for example, or in the 80s. But we have a trend towards centralization, which probably is mostly motivated by the intention like to capture like as many assets as possible. But on the other hand, it brings, probably unintentionally, it brings the consequence of the government having less and less control over the reality in terms of environmental, economic, external conditions, and so on. So I think to recapitulate, I think it would be good to focus on, of course, this external context is like fundamental, but I think that here in Poland, we are in a quite specific situations because not all of the trends we have here are just emanating from the outside. So if Hubert Walczyński speaks about the power of huge corporations, then I agree. That's a problem that is actually present in almost each country, although the intensity of the problem is different probably. In a country, for example, where you have a strong public media or a very good, well-financed opinion-building press, Germany, France, or else. But again, some of those problems can be solved here or have the source here in this state, and probably they are closer to what we can. I mean, the agency is rather in these sectors because I think we, as a, let's say, political community in Poland, have extremely little to do or little assets like to oppose the like power of Facebook or Google. But still, I think we have slightly more agency and ability like to deal with the problems which are structural, but structural in terms of the frame, within a much narrower frame like the nation state in Poland.
Okay, thank you very much. And we already, 1 hour passed, and now it's the time for questions or comments for you. So are there any volunteers? Okay, so Harald will be the first. And I might collect the voices, so are there any? Okay, Mateusz, Artur.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I have 4 points. I've tried to be brief and address people concretely. So Paul Ricoeur said once, the state has the greatest rationality because it can, in a way, assemble all the forces of society, but it can also do so because it also has the potential for the greatest evil, right? So that's the means that the state has at its disposal. So I would like to take that as a sort of like basis for my comments. And one is about the role of the state has expanded in the pandemic. You were talking about the unequal distribution of costs and benefits. And I think there is, for instance, the major, I think in my view, the major cost, certainly in Britain and other countries, was that the young generation was sacrificed for the old generation, roughly speaking, right? Sort of like the most vulnerable had to be protected, but those who had to pay the price were the children, the education, sociability. So this is just one example of how you, when you do things at a very general level and try to address this equally and universally, you will definitely produce, you know, say, victims. I would like to hear your views on that. Second, security. Now it's all about expanding the security sector in the name of defense of freedom and the nation. But of course, there are, you know, undercurrents here. One is the military-industrial complex. It seems to be a very old-fashioned terminology, but obviously there will be winners. There will be private corporate interests that will massively, you know, expand, and which we criticize on other levels when we say you should not invest your money in armament and that kind of industries. But of course, that is the future. So again, there's a huge contradiction going on. I'm not saying that it's, you know, that I want to solve that. It's unsolvable. But of course, the public discourse is absolutely one-sided and biased at the moment. Third point about Hubert's point about very, very good point, you know. He wants a publicly owned public square. The problem is, of course, we have our terminology of the polis and the oikos. This idea of the public and private has developed, but it comes originally from Greece. We know very well that the public square makes only sense if you can meaningfully participate, right? So there is a local, regional element in it. A global public square, although we talk about it, and it's the situation that we have right now, cannot really exist, because if you're just your existential background, so to speak, your participation, when you talk to somebody, you are in Argentina, the other one is in Finland, you can share many interests, but it's not a real public square. So I think the only way to go towards it is to try to relocalize our political life, which seems to be, you know, impossible. But I think what I'm trying to say here is there is a utopian element to think about a global public square, whether it is private or, you know, public. And the last point is a point of interest, and that's a Polish point. It's not only about terminology, but I'd like to hear from you, what's the relationship between społeczeństwo and władza and państwo? I mean, I know for a long time społeczeństwo was opposed against władza. It's not anymore like this in a democratic country, but I think there is still an undercurrent of a kind of confrontation or a kind of, you know, contradiction here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Harald, and now Mateusz.
Yeah, two quick points. Firstly, about the agile state, and I'll give a Polish example. Marcin actually made this point that due to do things quick, the present government created, like, doubled the institutions. We had Piotr Arak from the Polish Economic Institute, which does a lot of legislative work, really, outside of the Polish Ministry of Finance. So, you know, the small, quite agile, professional institutions were created, which are outside of scope of the normal, better paid and so, yeah, control of state institutions, So, firstly, what are the, good sides and bad sides of this kind of strategy of making the state more agile, and what are the prospects if the opposition wins? Because recent comment from a politician of the opposition was to, put down all those peace-created institutions, including BGK, which has 100 years and was like the Polish Developmental Bank, and was absolutely crucial in providing economic help to enterprises during the pandemic, for example, and many other things connected to the Ukrainian crisis. So that will be my question.
That? Sorry, just a question.
I can't remember the name.
But was that some important figure or some
Yeah,
minor?
it wasn't like, but I think the sentiment of, all right, let's take Izabela Leszczyna. She might be the next Minister of Finance if the opposition wins. So I'll stop. And maybe if you could talk also about subsidiarity in economic terms, cooperatives are something going beyond state versus the market divide, which is very much present, for example, in this little book by Benedict XVI that Rocco mentioned, Deus Caritas Est, as an economic idea, that there are different ways of doing economic activity outside of just state versus the market.
Okay, so in the first question round, I have voices from Artur, then Michael, and then Agnieszka.
Okay, it's more like a comment or an expression of my own frustration, but have you noticed any, how have you confrontation here? Because I haven't. And as I read your contributions to the whole feature of confrontations about different policies, there are no confrontations there. Okay, some minor differences, but it's not the real confrontation, which makes me, yes, frustrated that the life is elsewhere. That what we do here in our bubble it's not a useless knowledge, but it's a waste of time because politics works differently today than in the 80s when we were schooled how the politics works, and that the policy is the major input in politics. It's not anymore, looks like. It's the problem of accountability, obviously, that in contemporary democracies, politicians are not accountable, therefore they don't need policies, they don't need evidence-based policies, they don't need to have a perspective longer than the next election, then they don't need to cooperate if they feel that they have resources of their own. So that's, I don't know, how do you feel, but I've got an impression that this is not, okay, it's not useless, it's not a waste of time, but
the life is somewhere else.
But can you think about a connection between you and real life? I mean, real life politics. I'm quite serious. Can you imagine a politician, I don't know, a channel to, because it's the greatest example, this Polish Economic Institute. Okay, we don't have the director here, so we can speak freely. What did they do? What's their biggest achievement to prepare this new order economic reform? Which was sensible when they prepared this, and after 77 amendments by different politicians, different levels, it turned out to be, a monster, and nobody wants to give his or her name to this child today. Can you think about a channel of putting this kind of thought into the real life? That's the question, probably.
But by real life, you mean the life of politicians and their decisions?
Well, probably, yes. If you look at the pandemics, politicians were real life. They started with input of policy makers like those virus experts, but they get rid of them within weeks, and they started to think on their own. They ordered certain expert papers, and they just send it to a dustbin. Okay, so yes, I mean politics.
we will collect the voices from the audience and then come back to our panelists. So now Michael, then Agnieszka, and Julia.
I want to begin with passionate disagreement, just to make it fun. No, to actually celebrate this panel and what it represents. Because I feel like this panel begins to anticipate the kind of real life we need. And the kind of real life we need needs to be engaging one another on terms that one another can recognize. Because let me move into specifics. We have moved with this panel and in this conference away from state action in general to variations in state policies and practices. This is a very productive move, even though it frustrates philosophers of political theory, because we are not talking about the state in general. We're talking about state policies and practices. Very important move. Second thing, we're not just talking about state policies and practices around security in general. We are talking specifically about the war in Ukraine, which is different than the future war in Taiwan. And we have to think about how these things are different. Third, it feels like we are actually reinventing pragmatism. And by reinventing pragmatism, we are making much clearer what the moral foundations of pragmatism in a world facing epoch end is. And with that clarity, we can then begin to have the real debates. And this is why I playfully disagree profoundly, because the real debates, at least in the United States, are distractions from the real issues. We have, as it is called, affective polarization. This is the way in which politicians win, by appealing to emotions. And these emotions are about issues that are really important, but they are manufactured by political leaders in order to get votes, not in order to address real challenges. So we have a crisis in the United States about education, about teaching our children to hate one another on racial grounds. This is a myth. This is an illusion, but it is a good way for some political actors to distract from the issues of adequate resources for education that is in crisis. So, just to conclude then, one of the things that I find really attractive is a kind of politics that is rooted in intellectual responsibility. And I see that, and I will mention one sociologist in the United States who has been brilliant. Her name is Zeynep Tufekci. She has been investing in explaining why the state is incompetent in addressing the pandemic. And it was, of course, Trump, but it wasn't just Trump, because right now the Center for Disease Control is being itself transformed as a consequence of the kind of critical intellectual work that she has done, pointing out that the ways in which they collect data are inadequate. The ways in which they are actually communicating their message are terrible. This is pragmatism, but with intellectual vision, because it's about, concluding, intellectual responsibility in institutional practice. And I see that happening right here, and I'm very honored to be part of what this is.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last three voices, but please try to be as sharp as possible, okay?
Right. Well, I'm a scholar, so I'm afraid I'm going to frame my comments in rather abstract terms. My impression from the panel is that you were talking about state action in a kind of horizontal dimension, looking at different degrees of state actions across different policy areas. And somehow what I lacked, or I would have preferred to see more, was the vertical dimension. It somehow was there between when there was the discussion about who took care of the influx of Ukrainian refugees, whether it was a state or a local government. Well, then my question is, local government is whether it is a state or it's not a state, or whether by saying state we only mean, you know, central state state action. I would argue that local government is something we need to factor in here. But it's not only the subnational level, it's also the international and supranational level, namely the limits and shifting limits of state action at the supranational or international level, and how the state navigates between those levels quite strategically. And that, of course, comes from me as an EU scholar, because if you look, for instance, at some of state action, famous example of France, uploading the costs of its agricultural policy to the EU level for decades, right? Managing the costs in this way. The Eurozone crisis example, how the crisis was actually, how the costs were nationalized, although there was some tentative to Europeanize the costs. So I think this is the dimension that that we need to look at. And additional to that, I very much appreciated the comment about the capability expectation gap at the state level. And as EU scholar, I spent my entire career hearing about expectation capability gap at the EU level. But the thing is that the two are very much interrelated. And one way you can frame it is to look at the decoupling between, economic, socio-economic policies and politics. And the fact that a number of decisions regarding socio-economic politics have been somehow transferred to the international or supranational or public or private level. And what stays at the national level is politics. So there is not much room for socio-economic decisions to be made at the national level. What really stays is this kind of, identitarian cultural dimension where it is very easy to produce narratives, but not only because this is the question of, it's easier for decision makers to produce narratives than, addressing policy challenges, which is also obviously true, but also because that the room for maneuver at the national level is shrinking. So then there's also the question of what to do, whether there are any, possibilities of recoupling, and whether we do it at the national. Brexit was an example, or international, supranational level. I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And really short comments or questions, because we need to give an opportunity to the speakers to answer. Okay, Julia.
Actually, in kind of peace life, right, I'm interested in internet regulation, and so I wanted to kind of join the discussion on the public sphere and whether or not it's privately owned, or to me, the issue is not really who owns it. To me, the issue is actually the changes that have taken in the media sphere and how different media sphere currently is from the way it was sort of conceived in the ideal democracy, right? And so media actually, in democratic countries, they were privately owned for a long time, right? But issues started emerging when proliferation of media happened, at least in the United States. From what I understand, the issues started arising when the fairness doctrine was canceled. also then social media appeared, and so communication there happens in a totally different way. So people communicate horizontally, and also they can organized, like whereas a state is a territorial organization, and social media you organize basically based on issues. And also another major difference is that kind of traditional media, they took responsibility for what was happening on their pages, right? So they had editorial policies, and they regulated kind of what was happening in the public sphere. Whereas social media and basically internet, they take this attitude, okay, well, you know, it's not us, it's somebody else, so what do we have to do with this? But at the same, and so on the one hand, they refuse to take responsibility. On the other hand, they don't want state to participate in regulating it because we're internet, we're so different, we don't want you interfering, and we don't want you. But that it doesn't work that way, because if you take this hands-off approach, then whoever has the loudest voice actually ends up ruling it, and that's what we are actually witnessing at this point. And so to me, it's not so much about who owns it, but basically how do we establish rules, who gets to enforce those rules, and if it's not the state, then how do we get social media or whoever has the instruments of enforcement to enforce those, and what those rules are. Because if we try to apply kind of old ideas of human rights. I mean, I understand that those are important. Don't get me wrong; those are important. But in the different context, it's when. So freedom, like as they say very often, freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach, right? And so if you say something very controversial in private, okay, of course you have the right to have this idea, or, you know, like controversial, I mean calling for killing somebody or something like that. So it's one thing, but if you say this openly, and if you have the tools of the social media and the ability to organize people who think similarly, it's a totally different way of threat. So one person saying something, it's not a threat. And so we need to kind of start thinking that threats have changed, and think in terms of who has the instruments and who has the right to make rules, because now it's not who owns it, it's who, like what rules are and who has the right to enforce them.
Okay, the last voice, but we can always, you know, move to the lunch, to the discussion, but we have to give them an opportunity. So really short comment, please.
Yeah, does it work? Yeah, so just 2 comments. So first of all, I have this impression that you, Michael, described the crisis of democracy, and you also actually refer to the crisis of democracy, Agnieszka, with this comment about different narratives. I think this can be a very nice topic for the next conference or whatever, and I have another comment, which is what I'm hearing here brings me to the 19th century and to Michał Bobrzyński and his book of Poland's history. It's 150 years past, and we still here in Poland we have problems with institutions, and we don't really understand how to define their roles and what we want from the state, from ourselves. So it's very interesting. And I forgot to add to my first comment, this democracy crisis. I just would like to note that, come on, the tools of democratic processes, they were invented in 19th century. We are electing politicians for 4 years. We have internet. We can do many things just with 3 clicks. So this is just one example, but I think that if we want to change something, we should have a much more deeper discussion, deeper understanding what is happening, and also we should take into account the fact that different generations, like Generation Z and those who are older than me, they have completely different approaches and they have different values. And this brings me to one more point. I haven't heard a lot about values here. When we're talking, we did not refer to the values of the European Union. Like, you know, they were absent. We don't think about them anymore. do we think about interests? This just some comments, some teasing. That's it. And thanks for organizing this. I really enjoyed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask our panelists to stick to 3 minutes answers, please. So we might start, I don't know, Paweł, and then in an order.
Okay, first, victims. I very like your point because I agree with the thesis that yes, now we have young generation all over the Europe, not only on the south part of the Europe like in 2008, then we remember that Italian, Spanish, young generation experience feeling that, okay, my position is worse than my parents and I have no possibility to change that. And I think that this process now will be enlarged and will be transferred from the south of the Europe to all the Europe. And I think that we should remember that I said that our state was quite effective by means of crisis management in COVID-19 and the war of the Ukraine. But what this effectiveness mean? It means that we borrow a lot of money to stabilize the situation, but this money we go back, and who will pay this money? Of course, young generation. And we should remember that the situation now is not very bad because of the helicopter money, a lot of money that we probably had to borrow. I agree with the thesis that we have no other opportunity to do something else, but it has consequence on the young generation. Second aspect is about relation state-society. And I think that Poland has a very specific situation, maybe not the unique, because that's kind of process we see in US and in other societies, but how I look on this problem. In democracy, you have not only society and the government, but you have gatekeepers, that's the elite. And good democracy is when this elite has legitimacy and society respect the role of them, and only respect the role of them when these elites represent mindset or there is no important bias which limited the transfer of emotions, transfer of needs from the society to government. And I think that in Poland we have the problem with the bias of the elite, because they has liberal sometimes liberal left bias, which has consequence that our conservative government communicate with the society directly without this elite, and this elite is put aside, and that's the reason why these elites react strongly by huge critics, and these critics of course react to not listen even more hardly by the government. And
last 20 seconds,
okay,
please.
Okay, last sentence. So I think that, of course, it's not like whole society communicate with the government, but this part of society who support our government. But we should remember that in Poland we have 30% of the people usually moderate liberal in the big cities, and they respect the role of this elite, liberal elite, but more Polish society is rather conservative, by means of amount of numbers, and they communicate with the government, and they agree that we don't need this elite because they don't respect our mindset, don't respect our interests. Of course, I'm not happy with this situation. It's not working for our democracy, but this is explanation why we are in the process of polarization, because something wrong happened in this communicating between society, elites, government.
Thank you. Now, Hubert.
Okay, so I wanted to address this issue of who owns the media and the democratic crisis resulting from it. I think that the ownership is the crucial question, because ownership will result in media, social media or global corporations working either for profit or non-profit if we renationalize them or nationalize them. And it is crucial, and it actually intertwines with what Michał remarked earlier, I mean, about the lack of our agency. Obviously, none of us will nationalize Facebook, but in the public debate about the problems related to social media, the current answers are: 1, do nothing because companies will be best left on their own; to pay Facebook $3, $5, $10 per month, so they will not have to use our data to make profit via ads, via political marketing, etc. And basically that's it. So I just want to add a third option in which the social media, the platforms, do not have to be for profit, and therefore our data will not have to be used this way, and we will not need a lot of new bureaucracy related to how to govern the data, how to rule the data gathered by the companies on the international level, because it will be just way simpler this way, and I think better for consumers, and I think better for the democracy. And considering the question about society, społeczeństwo, władza and państwo, I wish I had a brilliant and smart answer, but I do not, so I'll pass the mic to the wiser. Thanks.
Thank you, now Kasia.
Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm the wiser, but I will do my best. Starting from the costs and victims, I think that here I agree with Paweł that the next future generation will pay for this helicopter money, and that we can see right now inflation ratio in Poland is 16.1%, and it's growing still. So I think that we already started paying for this. The relation between społeczeństwo, władza and państwo, yes, this is a very tough question, and what I would like to add, maybe as a representative of the liberal elite, which are hated by all the others, as I understood. But yeah, I would add one important remark, because I think that we cannot overcome the role of propaganda here, because we have to remember that national media in Poland are 100% politically involved. I mean, they are sources of propaganda, they are tools of propaganda, and they are for a huge part of Polish society, they are the only source of information, or the most they give most credentials to this national media. And we have Polish radio, which lost a lot of listeners because media market in Poland changed dramatically during last years. And we have new media that appeared, and they have nothing to do with public media or national media rather. But the television plays an important role in propaganda, and it is very well financed, because Polish television and radio, but mostly television, gets 2 billion zloty every year from the government, which is a crazy amount of money. And I wanted also to talk about the fact that there are, you asked, Mateusz, what will be the situation when the opposition will take the power. I don't know, because it depends on how this opposition will be constructed, how the alliances will look, how the new government will look like. And so I wanted to say that there are two ways of thinking about it as far as we know. We can go like producing this symmetric way of thinking, that everything will be the same but from the other side, or that there will be major changes, like, for example, closing down of the institutions that are not working or were created only to support government politics. And the last thing, it is about the fact that there are no confrontations among us here at this table. I think that if Paweł and I would sit in a television studio and we would be asked some particular questions, for example, about, I don't know, relations between Poland and European Union, we could express our views and they would be really different. And but the fact that we can sit at this table is, how you, Michael, said, crucial. And for me, it is super important that I can sit with Paweł and with Hubert and Jarema and Michał and Marcin at one table and discuss the most important matters of our everyday life, and that we can find, or at least try to find, our not maybe common voice, but some sort of agreement. And common space to discuss these things. And how could we approach real politics? I think that we are doing it, and that our actions go in this direction of being present in politics. We are think tanks. We are not politicians. We deliberately decided not to go into politics. We are most like some sort of advisory board, and it would be great if politicians would listen to us, and what we can do to build our impact on so-called real politics, we do. Me, for example, I've always been a happy academia professor teaching students in the Fine Arts Academy of Warsaw, but in the last years I had to change the direction of my work for going into the media, not only Kultura Liberalna, but to the main broadcasters in Poland, like the radio and the television, and to be present and to talk, because I can be heard this way. I have no other way to approach them.
Thank you. And now Jarema.
All right, 3 minutes. I turn on the timer. I'd like to address. Do you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Three points, 3 questions. The first from Professor Wydra, the relationship between society, state and the rulers, so to say, społeczeństwo, państwo and władza. During 33 years after the transition from communism to free market and democratic society, I think in Poland we didn't manage to convince people that the state is a common good, and this is why the state gets captured by the ruling parties. And here we come to your question about is local government a state? Technically it is, but we are so used to the fight between the central institutions and the local governments during law and justice governance that we regard them as totally different entities. I think this is why we talk about this in this way. And the third thing, very important, what Professor Wołek said, that there was no confrontation among us, and if there is a channel from here to the real life, to the decisions of the politicians. Well, I think experts and thinkers think similarly on a lot of issues, but they are divided from the politicians in Poland. Why? Because I think Poland didn't have enough time after 1989 to build strong institutions which would provide such a connection of those two groups, just like, for example, administration schools in France and so on. Then the internet revolution happened, the social media revolution happened, and we entered the era of post-politics, of Twitter politics. And here I go to the question, Marcin's question, are states still able to distribute the cost of policies well? Well, what does it mean well? It mean contributing to a common good in the best possible manner. Well, it's very difficult in the times of social media revolution, because this is a good environment for populism, because most of their time and energy the politicians waste on Twitter, on defending their image, reputation, gaining followers, fighting by means of the media, and this is why 2 billion zloty go to the so-called public television in Poland every year. There is no simple solution. We have to work on ethical and professional media, on institutions, just like I said, administration, schools, participation of people in governing and so on. But sometimes, time is over, sometimes to restrain the politicians. Maybe we should, last sentence, maybe we should invite politicians. I would like to invite politicians to conferences like this, but they will not come, and even if a politician would come here, he would sit and talk on the Twitter and then go away after half an hour. Yes.
Okay, and the last voice, if I can add, because already mentioned, Professor Matyja once said that Polish think tanks are not think tanks, but only internet magazines, and that is our connection to the real life. So the question is whether we have any contact with the real life.
Okay, first I come to rescue to all those who lacked confrontation here. Well, when I heard Paweł Musiałek saying that there should be no important bias, I mean difference between, of the mindset between the society and the government, and that the liberal left is very irritated if the government starts to communicate directly with the people, well, I can find an example when the society was actually communicating with the government very directly in a situation of a large difference in mindset. I mean, what happened in the autumn and winter 2020, and I think this was also without mediation of the liberal leftist intellectuals, because the slogan "Jebać PiS" and the song of Cypis, Polish rap musician, was not invented by Katarzyna Kasia or Andrzej Leder or Magdalena Schroeder or any other liberal leftist authority here. Yeah, so that's one thing. As to the question by Professor Artur Wołek, what I will say may sound naive, but I think this is not only about the period, about the era in politics. It's also about the external conditions. When we look at cases of agency of the political elite of a state, what comes to my mind, for example, is South Korea, where the main motivation for the state elite, like to modernize the country, the main motivation was the idea, the fear, that if we do not modernize our country, then the Kim Il-sung comes and they will cut our throats. Of course, there are a lot of changes in terms of like how the public sphere works. That's obvious. But on the other hand, we have a lot of changes in external conditions of politics here in Europe. Those post-political way of doing politics was, in my opinion, possible or tolerable in a situation where the external economic, social, natural conditions were, so to say, manageable easily without direct, efficient intervention of the state. In a situation when we will face more and more natural disasters, when we have a military threat from another country, I think this connection between policy and politics will be enforced by the principle of reality. That's my opinion. And the last thing, as to the room for maneuver, well, of course, we can agree that in terms of taxation policy or monetary policy, although this is controversial, this room for maneuver can be shrinking, although also the paradigms in the international debate are changing. So in terms of, for example, what should be the role of the central bank, a few years ago it was obvious this should be independent, focused on inflation and so on. Now we all know in the world it's more complicated, and we agree that it's more complicated and that states should be allowed to do more. But even without this context, I think we still have, and the Polish case again confirms that, we have still room for maneuver, because this is our meaning as a political entity decision. How much do we pay to the teachers? How much do we pay to the nurses? How much do we pay to the people working in public service? And this money we spend or we do not spend is not the amount that is totally out of touch with the general amount of budget. I mean, raising salaries for the teachers is a few billion zloty a year. Well, we just spend 40 for 500 plus, so it's not and this is also our decision, within our political community, how much or how do we spend the money that the state budget gets from the ETS system. And this is a huge amount of money that we did not spend for renewables, for green transformation, whatever you call it. We spend it generally for different purposes. And this was the political decision that was made at the level of the Polish nation state. Actually, in contradiction to what the general context, meaning the European Union, was expecting from us. So I believe still the room for maneuver is not infinite, but I believe we still have quite a lot to decide, and we have still some abilities to change the reality around us with the political means. I know Marcin wants to interrupt me, so this is why I'm okay. Yeah. So this would be probably that.
Okay, it's 19 after 1, so we exceeded a little bit, but I hope that you will forgive me that. I would like to thank you all for taking part in this seminar and spend so much hours in this room, and I would like to invite you for a lunch we deserve all. Thank you very much one more time, and hope to meet you in the future.